Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Let's do a little look around and tell yourself that you want to see whatever your eye lights on differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see that bamboo leaf differently. Let's do a couple. Above all else, I want to see that dog differently. Above all else, I want to see that hat differently. Above all else, I want to see that guitar differently. Above all else, I want to see that screen differently. Now you fill them in. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Look around and just tell yourself, above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see that differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Okay, well, if you did that along with me and told yourself when your eye lighted on something that I want to see that differently, and you did that for that couple minutes, then you've got one of your practice periods. We're supposed to have 6 today. Be sure to have 5 more today. We'll do one more as we close. I'm Forgiveness Willie. Some of these are open-eyed practice periods, and some of them are closed eyes, a little of both. And here we're on lesson 20. I didn't write it down. Lesson 28. Here on Tuesday, January the 28th of 2025. It's actually Saturday for me, a few days before that, so I can get it uploaded for you. We're reading from the Foundation for Inner Peace version of A Course in Miracles this year. Above all else, I want to see things differently. And, I'm just wanting to share forgiveness with the whole world. And we're using A Course in Miracles to do it. And let's read through lesson 28. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Today we're really giving specific application to the idea for yesterday. Yesterday was above all else I want to see. Today we're really giving specific application to the idea for yesterday. Above all else, I want to see things differently as today. In these practice periods, you will be making a series of definite commitments. The question of whether you will keep them in the future is not our concern here. If you are willing at least to make them now, you have started on the way to keeping them. And we are still at the beginning. You may wonder why it is important to say, for example, above all else, I want to see this table differently. In itself, it is not important at all. Yet what is by itself? And what does in itself mean? You see a lot of separate things about you, which really means you are not seeing at all. You either see or not. When you have seen one thing differently, you will see all things differently. The light you see in any one of them is the same light you will see in them all. When you say, above all else, I want to see this table differently, you're making a commitment to withdraw your preconceived ideas about the table and open your mind to what it is and what it is for. You're not defining it in past terms. You're asking what it is rather than telling it what it is. You're not binding its meaning to your tiny experience of tables, nor are you limiting its purpose to your little personal thoughts. It's that relationship it has with the whole universe that we're wanting to begin to see, instead of dividing the world into separate parts, separate things. We want to see the whole, the action part, the verb part, rather than the isolated thing part. Okay? You will not question, paragraph 4, you will not question what you already have defined. And that's why we started off our very first lesson. I do not know what anything means. Because he's saying right here, you will not question what you've already defined. And we want to have an open mind so we can become miracle workers. This is the way to do it. You will not question what you already have defined. And the purpose of these exercises is to ask questions and receive the answers. In saying, above all else, I want to see this table differently, you're committing yourself to seeing. It is not an exclusive commitment. It is a commitment that applies to the table just as much as to anything else, neither more nor less. You could, in fact, gain vision from just that table if you would withdraw all your own ideas from it and look upon it with a completely open mind. It has something to show you, something beautiful and clean and of infinite value, full of happiness and hope. Hidden under all your ideas about it is its real purpose, the purpose it shares with all the universe. In using the table as the subject for applying the idea for today, you are therefore really asking to see the purpose of the universe. You will be making the same request of each subject that you use in the practice periods. And you are making a commitment to each of them to let its purpose be revealed to you, instead of placing your own judgment upon it. We will have 6 2-minute practice periods today, in which the idea for the day is stated first and then applied to whatever you see about you. Not one, because so you're going to basically say the idea, above all else, I want to see things differently, and then you're going to do the 2 minutes of just observing what's about you. Not only should the subjects be chosen randomly, but each one should be accorded equal sincerity as today's idea is applied to it, in an attempt to acknowledge the equal value of them all in their contribution to your seeing. Okay, so we don't want to say that, well, that's in our mind thinking that that's more important, so I'm going to maybe spend more time on looking at it or or just, oh, I really need to include that because that's really important. We don't want to do that. We just want to look at everything with the same amount of equality. As usual, the applications should include the name of the subject your eyes happen to light on, and you should rest your eyes on it while saying, above all else, I want to see this blank differently. Each application should be made quite slowly and as thoughtfully as possible. There is no hurry. Okay, now let's go take a look in our text reading for today. And we're ready for, in chapter 4, the illusion of the ego, or the illusions of the ego, section 2, the ego and false autonomy. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, because the past does not matter. And history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific, and therefore quite concrete. The impersonal nature of life. Paragraph 2. Everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both, because they were not made by or with the unalterable, and that's capital U, the unalterable reality, God. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact. There could be no better example that the ego is only an idea and not a fact, that you can change your perception of it just by of the other ego by just thinking about it. You don't have to actually be physically nearby. Your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. Paragraph 4. Think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. That is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self. 5. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you most. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in the effort to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that must go together. Harmfulness and helpfulness, attributes that must go together. Your attitudes, even towards this, are necessarily conflicted because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. That's nice to know. Paragraph 6, only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can truly be charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better and can therefore do without the thing you gave or that you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem in ego terms means nothing more than that the ego has deluded itself in accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. 7. The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance because it was made as a substitute for abundance. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. 8. The ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. There's your definition of the ego. The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. Oh. Well, there went my umbrella. We'll just let her be. Spirit in its knowledge is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned to mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature that the most benevolent of them is not without fearful connotations. 9. Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins, and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth, because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. 10. Salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. The ego cannot survive without judgment. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic, because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. In the last paragraph, 11, it cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. Let's read that again. It cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient. It is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone towards it. The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. This removes the block entirely. You may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. And that is a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the, in quotes, you who are living in the world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. That is its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. Okay, well, let's see. That was a little longer reading today. Let's see what's going on around the world. The feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, that's a Catholic feast. Nice saying, he said, to one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one without faith, no explanation is possible. Christa McAuliffe Day, the teacher who went into space and was killed in the process, happened on this day in 1986. Daisy Day, the oxeye daisy, the Leucanthemum vulgare, is the oxeye daisy around here in the Ozarks. And I found on Washington College that it says that those oxeye daisies are good for, they've been used for asthma and whooping cough. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Global Community Engagement Day, Blueberry Pancake Day, Kazoo Day, Plan for a Vacation Day. I'd say this time of year, plan for a garden. Of course, you might like to vacate into your garden. Have a hammock out there. Rattlesnake Roundup Day. I don't know about roundup and rattlesnakes in the wintertime, but Rubber Ducky Day, Speed Up and Succeed Day. And that reminds me of, Speak Up and succeed today. It reminds me of something my grandpa used to always say. The only stupid question is the one you don't ask. Thank a plug-in developer day. And then out of edible landscaping, we've got the cut leaf elderberry. And while I'm turning there, the timber rattlers, the rattlesnake we've got around here, the Crotalus horridus. And you know, the Native Americans used to use that venom from that rattlesnake for anti-cancer, for to fight cancer. That was pretty cool. Okay, let's see. Out of edible landscaping, the cut leaf elderberry, a most beautiful form of elderberry, a 6 to 8 foot shrub with deep cut lobed leaves followed by large heads of creamy white flowers and shiny berries, pollinates with black lace, elderberry, spaced 6 to 8 foot circles, zones 3 through 9, and it's a European elderberry. It's a Sambucus genus, but it's a nigra as far as its species. It's not the canadensis that we've been reading about. Okay, let's see. I think, and our word for peace is Anachemowegan. Anachemowegan. I think that's a Mohican language from the Hudson River Valley of the northeastern part of the United States. So let's close with one more time doing our above all else I want to see and look around for 2 minutes. And Anachemowegan, peace be with you, out of Mohican. Above all else I want to see things differently. Above all else I want to see things differently. Above all else I want to see differently. Fill in the blank, whatever you see. Above all else I want to see differently. Above all else I want to see differently. Above all else I want to see that blowing umbrella differently. Above all else I want to see 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 differently. When I hum, you be sure you fill in blank. Above all else I want to see differently. 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 And then let's close with above all else I want to see things differently. Above all else I want to see things differently. And our word for peace out of Mohican, Anachemowegan. Anachemowegan. Above all else, I want to see things differently. Anachemowegan.